John Avlon. John Avlon was chief speechwriter for Rudy Giuliani when he was America's mayor. I don't know if you knew this. Almost 2 decades now before Giuliani's strange slide into whatever it is that he has become. But I want to tell you something about this because most of us here probably remember how people felt so bonded, and people of all different stripes and political backgrounds, races and politics held together in the face of the devastation of 9/11. I think most of us were there and remember this. After the attacks of September 11th, John and his team were responsible for writing the eulogies of all firefighters and police officers murdered in the destruction of the World Trade Center. And John's essay on the attacks, called The Resilient City, was the last essay in a compilation entitled Empire City, New York Through the Centuries, and it won acclaim as the single best essay written in the wake of 9/11. I think that's astonishing, so kudos to you. So he's been kind of thinking about America for a while. From 2015 to 2018, John was editor-in-chief and managing director of the Daily Beast. He's the author of several books: Independent Nation, Wingnuts, How the Lunatic Fringe is Hijacking America, and Washington's Farewell. You should also know that John is a very dedicated Sag Harbor enthusiast, helping to lead the charge to save another author's house and property for future generations, and that author is John Steinbeck. You might have read about that in the paper. With the help of Catherine Zoka, who is selling books. Oh, I'm making a book plug. Now, normally John is on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert, or The Daily Show, or Bill Maher, or at his workplace at CNN as a pundit and anchor. But tonight he's here with us at the church, and we could not be prouder to have him speak at our third Knowledge Fridays evening. He's a centrist, and if ever there was a need for a plumb line leading to peace between the messy factions of our fractured nation, it is now. In Lincoln and the Fight for Peace, John tackles the problem through both the character and wisdom of Abraham Lincoln, an inspirer-in-chief in the face of not only war, but in his work in imagining peace after and during Reconstruction, and how it would succeed if it could. The book is inspired, inspiring, and a game changer. I'm reading it now, and it's phenomenal. So please welcome John Avlon.
Thank you, I think I'm mic'd up, so I don't need this bad boy. But thank you so much, April and Eric, and all of you for being here. I mean, Sag Harbor is home. It is a place we love, and where our kids have grown up, often walking over to Steinbeck House. And it's wonderful to see so many friends in the audience tonight. And this community is an extraordinarily special, almost sacred place. The fact that the quality of the humans here, the quality of life, the human scale, and the enormous gift that the church is, thanks to Eric and April and everyone who works here. It just highlights that spiritual dimension of the artistry, and particularly the literary tradition in Sag Harbor, which really makes it stand out, not only on the East End and in New York, but around the nation. She mentioned the Steinbeck House, and the fact that Travels with Charlie begins in Sag Harbor is many people's first introduction to Sag Harbor around the country, around the world. And it's a magic place. And I wrote most of Lincoln here. I wrote and researched it over 4 years, but much of the writing happened right here in Sag Harbor, sometimes on the 3rd floor of the Germain Library, often sort of tucked away in our house on John Street. So this is a homecoming, and it's a real pleasure to be with you all. The book's been out just a few weeks, and the reception has been great, but this is, in some ways, the most fun event I've done yet. I'll start out by answering the obvious question, which is, why would any idiot try to write another book on Abraham Lincoln? This is a reasonable question, as my wife often posits to me. There have been literally, this blew my mind when I found this out, 16,000 books written about Abraham Lincoln. It's like second only to Jesus, which actually is sort of appropriate for reasons I'll get to later. And so, you know, it's not enough to simply want to write a book about Abraham Lincoln. And I'll tell you, he is great company. 4 years researching and writing about the guy, he never disappoints. But that's not a good enough reason. So I had this idea about a portrait of Lincoln as a peacemaker. And the book is about Lincoln's plan to win the peace after winning the war, his vision of national reconciliation and reunification. And I spoke to a couple Lincoln scholars I knew. I went out to the Abraham Lincoln bookstore in Chicago, and there's a guy named Daniel Weinberg. It was started by Carl Sandburg, a guy named Daniel Weinberg who's been there for 50 years, spent his whole life there. And I said, listen, here's the idea. Has this been done? Am I stretching? And he looked around the room, looked at all, these are 3 rooms, big rooms full of books only about Abraham Lincoln. And he said, I'll be damned. I don't think anyone's done that. So I said, great, this is good. The reason, by the way, is pretty obvious. He's assassinated 5 days after Appomattox, after Lee surrenders to Grant at Appomattox. So he never gets to implement his vision for winning the peace. But that left an opening which I was delighted to take, because the fact is that if you look at Lincoln's own words and statements, from presidential proclamations dating to 1863 to his second inaugural address, which is really where the book begins, to his last speech on the lawn of the White House, supposedly celebrating the end of the war, but really where he sets out a very sober vision of the principles he hopes will guide Reconstruction. He has been thinking throughout the war about how to win the peace. And that's extraordinary, because typically wartime leaders are focused on that one goal: win the war. Win the war at all costs. Nothing else matters. But there'd never been a civil war on that scale before in human history. Lincoln didn't have a historic precedent he could look to. Like even the founding fathers could look to, ancient Rome and the Greek and Roman Republic and say, well, we're going to learn from their mistakes and their successes and incorporate that in our founding documents. His core insight was that in a civil war, you cannot simply pound the opponents into submission and salt the fields and forget about them. You need to find a way to live together again. And what Lincoln understood was that if you don't win the peace, you don't really win the war. And that's a lesson that we struggle with all the time today. It's also a portrait of Lincoln's leadership. He is a reconciler in a time of radicals and reactionaries. Democracy is on trial. America is the world's sole democratic republic at the time. Liberty is on trial. 4 million slaves at the time. It's an insurrection that instigated by the mere fact of his election. He says this is about whether people can contest from the ballot to the bullet. But it's also a question of whether Lincoln can extinguish the resentments and the hatreds and remove the root cause of the war so that the next war doesn't ignite on the ashes of the past. And he calls that the greatest test ever put to practical statesmanship. He says it requires the wisdom of a serpent and the gentleness of a dove. And it's that combination of opposites that's so characteristic of Lincoln. He is born in the South. He moves north and west as a young man. He is buffeted in his own soul between depression and humor and laughter, which he uses as medicine, to the point where he's criticized all the time by his contemporaries for telling too many jokes at inappropriate times. But he knows also that's part of his strategy of speaking in parables, something he learns from Aesop, something he learns from the Bible, that's a more effective means of communication. And he uses humor to disarm opponents. The reason he stands out, I think, today, in contrast to many of the leaders we've recently had, is because of something that we forget but that's really basic and important to remember when you're dealing with historic figures or any leader. First, character is the single most important quality in a president, by far. Nothing else really matters. When Lincoln assumes the presidency, he seems like the worst person imaginable to lead the nation through civil war. He's the leader of an upstart third party, first Republican president for the Republican Party. He's never held executive office. He's never really held any military office. And, he's had one term in Congress, like a decade and a half before. So he is attacked and derided and dismissed, but he has character and he has the capacity to learn and grow. And he also has the essential qualities of his personality. And this is something that fascinates me because I think we do forget how often people's personality end up determining their principles, which end up being reflected in their politics and their policies. And Lincoln's personality is itself, in some ways, incredibly ill-suited to war. He is a man of peace fundamentally in a time of war. His personality is defined by an absence of malice. I think the four core qualities of Abraham Lincoln are empathy, honesty, humor, and humility. He has an amazing ability to empathize with his opponents as a means of reasoning with them. He never demonizes people he disagrees with, even when they're calling for his death. I was struck, even in private. A lot of red meat's being thrown rhetorically around even then, right? Politics could get rough, like Civil War rough. He is extraordinary in that not only doesn't indulge in that, he never talks about us versus them. He's the opposite of a demagogue. But even in private, he doesn't. In private, he calls Jefferson Davis the President of the Confederacy and Robert E. Lee Jeffy D. and Bobby Lee. And there's something a little dismissive in that, but also it's familial, right? It's a reminder that Civil War is ultimately a fight between brothers. His honesty, honest Abe, that was true at the time, but it was something that even his enemies couldn't credibly deny. He was honest, and that created enormous credibility when he was in negotiations. His humor was legendary. He had a sort of backwoods common sense. His jokes were published in newspapers, but it was a very effective means of disarming people that he dealt with. And then there was a humility. And it was a moral humility, which is different than a lack of ambition. He was ambitious. Don't get me wrong. But he had a Midwestern modesty and a moral humility in the eyes of God that was related to his late-breaking religiosity. He was never a member of any denomination. A lot of the icons of our politics are sort of claimed by different religions as their own. He's a youthful sort of skeptic / freethinker, but after the death of his son Willie in the White House in 1862, he does become more religious. There's really odd stories about how he reads the book of Job for comfort, which, if you know anything about the Bible, is pretty extraordinary. But it's this moral humility. And his politics are defined by moderation. He's temperamentally moderate. He doesn't swing, he doesn't indulge in hate. But combined crucially and critically with moral courage. He says to Noah Brooks, a journalist he's friends with, physical courage, I'm not big on that. I'm not sure if I was a soldier, I might drop my gun and run at the first sign of someone shooting at me. But, he says, moral courage is, I think, something I always had. And he does. And it's that combination of moral courage and moderation that I think makes all the difference. He practices what I call the politics of the golden rule. He treats other people as he would like to be treated, which is actually profound and profoundly difficult to do, particularly during a civil war. He believes that decency can be the most effective form of politics, but he understands that people are more willing to listen to reason when they're greeted from a position of strength. So he's not naive. He mocks people who say, well, people are saying we should have peace at any cost. He says, what, do you expect me, maybe I can win this war by shooting rose water at my enemies? There's no substitute for victory in elections or on the battlefield. He knows that. But it's the second piece that forms, I think, his true genius and the core equation of Lincoln's prescription on how to win a peace. It's unconditional surrender followed by a magnanimous peace. You reach out, you lift people up, you build them back. once they've accepted defeat, and defeat is decisive. And that's a tricky balance. It's combining strength with mercy. But it's a necessary balance. And as I'll explain, the book takes a bit of an odd turn in terms of the long-term effects, the afterlife of the ideas that Lincoln represented, particularly with regard to winning the peace. But I want to just take a break here, and we're going to get to some questions, and just read you the opening bit of the book, where Lincoln goes to Richmond. This is, I think, one of the most unbelievably cinematic moments in American history, and it gets really short shrift even in like multi-volume biographies of Lincoln, for reasons that I can't fully explain. Lincoln goes to the front lines in the last weeks of his life. He actually is seeking refuge from Washington and thinks that going to the front lines would be arrest. But also he wants to prod the soldiers and the generals to finally ending the war. He's been urging his generals to be more aggressive throughout the war. It's been a problem until he gets Ulysses S. Grant, whose nickname among his troops is Unconditional Surrender Grant. He's at the front lines. He's talking to his generals. He's sending home his message about a magnanimous peace. He said, I want to give them the most liberal and honorable terms. He wants to offer amnesty to the Confederate rank and file, but crucially not the Confederate leadership. He doesn't want to hang them, which is the traditional punishment for treason, but he wants to make sure that they can't regain their property and their power. He's there for almost 2 weeks. And most of the time, his only companion is his son, Tad, who's 12 years old. So Lincoln has 4 sons, but 3 that make it to the White House. Tad is the last one at home. Robert's actually working for Ulysses S. Grant, the eldest. He finally hears, after a 9-month siege, Petersburg falls. Richmond is doomed. Richmond's evacuated within 1 day. The Confederate cabinet skedaddles out of town, trying to reconfigure itself. Union soldiers, Union troops march into Richmond, and the town's already been lit on fire by the Confederates, who want to ruin if they can't rule. The first troops into Richmond is a black regiment, which was effectively written out of history, as often happens. But you'll see that actually the participation of black Union soldiers, there were 180,000 of them by the end of the war, is pivotal to turning the tide. It's also pivotal to turning the tide of prejudice and bigotry. 25 black Union soldiers, by the way, win the Medal of Honor. It's extraordinary. And that aspect of the war and Lincoln's championing of it ultimately deserves much more attention, and they deserve more credit for making a decisive difference in the war. But Lincoln hears that finally Richmond has fallen. It is not secured, but he says, I want to go to Richmond. His generals try to say, this is a pretty bad idea. This is still wild. You could get shot in a heartbeat. He says, I want to go to Richmond. So he rides upriver on April 4th, 2 days after the town's fall, and with his son Tad on the boy's 12th birthday. And they go up the river, and Lincoln almost dies in a bizarre boating accident involving a barge getting brought into a wheel of a steamship. His big ship gets stalled. He ends up coming in on basically a longboat. There's no troops to meet him. He doesn't come in as a conquering hero, but it's his tone and tenor that makes all the difference. So I'm just going to read you a couple of passages from the opening of the book and his trip to Richmond. Abraham Lincoln walked into the burning Confederate capital, uphill from the river, passing abandoned slave markets on his right, holding his son Tad's hand on the boy's 12th birthday. After 4 years of civil war, the President of the United States was in Richmond. Now he knew that all the suffering had not been in vain. Liberty and union would defeat slavery and secession. He did not stride into the city like a conquering hero, flanked by a vast army. Instead, he arrived on a longboat with a small crew, including an admiral, a bodyguard, and a dozen soldiers who acted as oarsmen. There was no military escort waiting to greet them as they scraped ashore. They were strangers in a strange land, wandering past burnt-out buildings that jutted up like tombstones as smoke billowed against a blue sky. A low murmur rose among the ruins at the sight of the 6'4" man in black, slightly stooped, topped by his signature stovepipe hat. It was the sound of rumor turning to revelation. A crowd of liberated slaves gathered around Lincoln. They grabbed at his clothes and fell at his feet. "Don't kneel to me," Lincoln gently rebuked them. "That is not right. You must kneel to God only and thank Him for the liberty you will afterward enjoy." Thomas Morris Chester, a pioneering black war correspondent for the Philadelphia Press, was among the first journalists to see Lincoln enter the rebel capital, and he scribbled down scenes of celebration. Quote, "Old men thanked God in a very boisterous manner, and old women shouted upon the pavement as high as they had ever done at a religious revival," he wrote. There were many whites in the crowd, but they were lost in the great concourse of American citizens of African descent. Those who lived in the finest houses either stood motionless upon their steps or merely peeped through the window blinds. It seemed that the meek would finally inherit the earth, or at least Richmond. So Lincoln wanders into town. He's lost. There are no soldiers. He finally bumps into a New York regiment who takes him to Jefferson Davis's Confederate White House, where he enters and he sits in Jefferson Davis's chair. Looks out the window, takes a tour of the Confederate White House, talks to his generals, sends orders that we must be magnanimous with the citizenry. He speaks to black former slaves who'd been liberated, surrounded and flanked by black troops, and he tells them that now your so-called masters, you are their equal. You have been guaranteed life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and you will now hereafter be free to enjoy it. He has two extraordinary moments I'll read you. One is, at one moment, he's climbing up a hill, and he stops to wipe his brow, and an older black man approaches the president, takes off his hat, places it over his heart, and says, "May the good Lord bless you, President Lincoln." The president responded by removing his own hat and bowed in return. It was a bow that upset the forms, laws, customs, and ceremonies of centuries, observed Charles Cofton of the Boston Journal. It was a death shock to chivalry, a mortal wound to caste. As they passed the notorious Libby prison, where more than 1,000 Union officers had been held in horrific conditions, Lincoln pointed out the brick and iron structure to his son. The crowd shouted, "Tear it down!" But the president raised his hand and quieted them, saying, "No, leave it as a monument." Healing could not occur by simply erasing history. It would require learning the right lessons, so we were not condemned to repeat it. Finally, after this momentous day where he meets with some members of the Confederate cabinet, he's trying to get a feeling for the people. He visits the ramshackle, now basically ransacked Confederate capital. He decides to stay one night, and he's going to spend the night on a boat in the harbor because it's unsafe. There are rumors of assassination everywhere. And the commanding general who's overseeing Richmond is actually a 29-year-old German immigrant named Godfrey Weitzel. And Weitzel asks him, before he goes out to his boat for the night, how should we treat the rebels and the citizens under his command? And Lincoln characteristically offers advice rather than an order. He says, "We must extinguish our resentments if we expect harmony and union. If I were in your place, I'd let him up easy. Let him up easy." And the stories of Lincoln are so powerful because he leads with example. The words often are well known, but it's actually his personal example that's the most profound thing, particularly in the last weeks of his life. There's a scene where he's visiting wounded Union soldiers at a massive field hospital, and he's going around to each one and shaking their hand and talking to them, and he gets very emotional. The toll of the war weighs on him heavily. One of the things he's doing at this time, he reads from Macbeth aloud all the time. He feels the weight of the war. And he's finishing up, shaking hundreds, if not thousands, of hands. And he's getting ready to leave, and he notices a tent out back, smaller, but still pretty big. And he says, what's that over there? And the doctor who's leading him around is kind of an imperious guy, says, oh, you don't need to worry about that. Those just wounded rebels. And Lincoln says, that's exactly where I do need to go. And he goes there, and he does the same thing. He shakes their hand. He looks at them in their eye. He hears their story. And what you see from them in their reminiscences decades later is they were so moved by Washington, by the kindness in his eyes. Many would break down and cry because they realized they'd been fighting for a lie. They'd been told he was a butcher and a tyrant, King Abraham Africanus I. And they realized that he was a kind man and a good man who wanted the nation to reunite. And that example stayed with them the rest of their lives. And Lincoln's example did endure even after his death. You know, he had disciples who carried forward his message, many of whom were just inspired by the man's kindness and the example that kindness can be consistent with effective leadership. The tragedy, of course, occurs is that Lincoln is best suited to be a president during peacetime. One of the newspaper clippings found in his wallet the night of his death said, it was an editorial from a Philadelphia newspaper, it said, after a term of war, he's entitled to a term of peace. Indeed, actually, the jacket he's wearing that night has an embroidery that says, One Nation. Andrew Johnson is the opposite of Lincoln as a matter of character. He knew him from their one term in Congress, but he is an intemperate man. He swings between radical and reactionary. An article from the Atlantic magazine, monthly at the time, magazine, still exists today, describes him as egotistic to the point of mental disease. He's thin-skinned and resentful. You read the whole thing and it sounds like someone we know. And Johnson gets the country off on perfectly the wrong path. He empowers the planter class in the South to regain power. Confederates are serving in statewide elected office. The black codes pass. I didn't realize this until I researched this. These are the laws that basically tried to institutionalize slavery without the chains after the 13th Amendment. Those start getting passed in the Deep South and the states in the late summer and fall of 1865. And Johnson's encouraging this, in effect, and he's bitterly resentful of anything resembling equal rights. And so we get it perfectly wrong. The pendulum swing goes awry. You know, he disbands the Freedmen's Bureau, which had been set up to try to move slaves to self-sufficiency and to help white refugees in the wake of the South. He vetoes civil rights laws. Then the radical Republicans react and bring troops back into the South, which increases resentment. That crucial window is lost. Ulysses S. Grant gets us back on the Lincoln path. He's heard from Lincoln directly over and over. The terms that he signs with Grant and Appomattox are basically just taking dictation from Abraham Lincoln. And he does some extraordinary things that he doesn't get enough credit for. I mean, he goes to Congress personally to lobby for the passage of an anti-Ku Klux Klan Act called the Enforcement Act that gives him the power to take down the first incarnation of the KKK very effectively. And he has it implemented by a Southern Attorney General named Amos T. Ackerman, and actually sends the leadership of the Klan to prison up in Albany. But then those gains are given away, particularly after the 1876 election, where Republicans lose the popular vote and they basically make a trade to get one more term in power in exchange for abandoning Reconstruction. And slavery is replaced for segregation by a century. And the Reconstruction story is particularly resonant because you see the way that despite the 14th and 15th Amendments, the right to vote is removed through violence and intimidation and election subversion. It's a horrific story. But the unexpected turn in the book for when you all read it, is the afterlife of the idea even beyond Lincoln's contemporaries. It goes back to this question of how you win a peace. And we look at Woodrow Wilson, who's a child of the Confederacy. He grows up, his father's actually a clergyman who does these pamphlets about the biblical defenses of slavery. And Wilson ultimately grows out of his bigotry, although he's very resentful. Doesn't grow out of his bigotry, he resegregates the federal government. But he goes to Princeton and he says, I rejoice in the failure of the Confederacy because I'm a proud Southerner. He comes to office, and when the World War I breaks out, you can see his experience as someone who grew up in a state that lost a war suffuses his approach to everything. He says to Congress, we want a peace without victory, a peace among equals. He goes to Versailles, and he perfectly misapplies Lincoln's principles. I should have said that Lincoln actually used to carry around in his own writing his 3 indispensable conditions for peace. One was a resumption of the Union, acceptance of federal authority by the Southerners. The second, an end to slavery for all time. The third is less obvious. It's no ceasefire before surrender. And he gets a lot of criticism for this because they say, look, can't we just, we'll stop the killing and then we'll figure it all out. And he refuses to do it because he's afraid, with good reason, that there will be backsliding on slavery unless there's surrender. And then you don't remove the root cause of the war, we're just going to have another one. Wilson does a ceasefire before surrender. There's armistice, and then there's negotiations. And that sets off this protracted period of negotiation. Actually, Lincoln is hanging over the proceedings, not only in Wilson's psyche, but the British Prime Minister David Lloyd George grew up having a portrait of Lincoln over his mantelpiece in Wales and quotes from him all the time. George Clemenceau, the French Prime Minister, actually had, as a young man, worked as a reporter covering Reconstruction in the South. But they get it perfectly wrong. There's a ceasefire before surrender, and then there's these punishing reparations without the means for Germany to ever repay them and not the means to actually enforce the harsh terms. And Wilson trades it away to get the League of Nations, but never gets bipartisan buy-in to establish that, so that goes away as well. And then pretty soon you see a lost cause mythology develop in Germany in the form of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. The World War II generation are the grandchildren of the Civil War. And they are deeply affected by Lincoln's example and the failures of Versailles. And during the Second World War, they resolved that they are going to win the peace this time. FDR says it. They have a working group from state and treasury and defense working on how you win the peace through military governance. The official position from FDR and Churchill is unconditional surrender, followed by a magnanimous peace. FDR actually gives a whole press conference where he's talking about it and basically tells a story about Appomattox to explain what he means by unconditional surrender. And the ultimate expressions, the ultimate vindications of Lincoln's vision come in the form of the occupations of Germany, Japan, and the Marshall Plan. And if you think I'm stretching here, I'll give you kind of the buried lead of the book, which was a quote I found from Lucius Clay, who's an American general who was a son of the South, born 30 years after in Georgia, 30 years after the Civil War. And somebody asked him what guided his decisions during the German occupation. And he said, I tried to think what Abraham Lincoln would have done for the South if he had lived. MacArthur's father was a Medal of Honor winner in the Civil War. He was preoccupied by this question of how you can have a successful occupation. And then the Marshall Plan is really the thing that caps it all off. Truman, whose grandparents had been Southern sympathizers, working with George Marshall and Republican Senator Arthur Vandenberg from day one. They're like, a couple of people suggested Truman. They said, you should put your name on this. This is a major, we're going to invest in peace to stabilize Europe. He said, listen, I'm really unpopular on Capitol Hill right now. If you put my name on this, it's going to quiver a couple of times and die. Put Marshall's name on it. They really like him up there, especially the Republicans who are controlling Congress at the time. From day one, they start working with Vandenberg to get buy-in from Republicans. And they set it up as this incredible investment in peace. It is the opposite of reparations, but it's constrained over a 3-year period. It's run by a Republican businessman to make sure it's not a new sort of open-ended New Deal type situation. And they get bipartisan buy-in. And it makes all the difference. You know, one of the things we're dealing with right now is the fact that we can take democracy for granted. That's a danger in America. We can take peace for granted, particularly in Europe. That's what we're seeing right now. The last 75 years of peace and prosperity in Europe is a total departure from the history of Europe. It's because we won the peace after the Second World War. It's because of the Marshall Plan and the international organizations that were set up by the United States and its allies. And those were put in place with Lincoln's direct inspiration. And that's the story of how you win a peace after winning a war, and how Lincoln's vision was finally vindicated long after his death. So I'd love to take questions, have some conversation, but thank you all for joining me. I think we've got some it's small enough. We got a microphone, or you can yell. Peter, I know you got big lungs.
This is A. One, in your research, did you discover one of those thousands of books that stood out, that surprised you, and why? And could you recommend one of those other books on Lincoln after we read yours?
Sure.
And then the second part is, if Lincoln was here today, looking at the Republican Party, could he remain in it?
Second question, no. And here's why. We get distracted sometimes with labels. Lincoln was a Republican, the Southerners were Democrats. That's true. But if you take the time to actually look to see what the party stood for, the Republican Party was a big tent party of moderate progressives. It stretched everything from abolitionists to people who only wanted to stop slavery's expansion. They were the progressive party of their time. There's a cartoon I use in the book. It's Courier and Ives, and it's this attack on the Republican Party in 1860, and it's Lincoln being led into an insane asylum on the back of a rail, carted by all these special interests. And it's literally like, a proto-feminist who hates all men, and a drunk guy holding a bottle who wants the government to pay for his booze, and a dandified racist representation of a black man saying, basically doing the reverse racism argument. I mean, it's all stuff ripped out of headlines, directed at the Republican Party at that time as a collection of radical special interests. Democrats were based in the South, obviously. They were conservative populists. They were, in many cases, elites posing as populists, deathly afraid of demographic change. That's why they wanted slavery to expand, because otherwise they figured they would lose their power electorally. So it's so they come up with a blood and soil vision of America. They rig congressional rules to have disproportionate influence. They threaten violence. And most sinister, they believe that losing an election is tantamount to losing their way of life, and that's a psychological precondition of civil war. So, your other question is more fun, which is about other Lincoln books. There's so many great Lincoln authors. The ones that surprised me, David Herbert Donald's book is amazing. Harold Holzer and Michael Burlingame, who write now, are great. But in terms of writing, there was a standard single volume by a guy named Benjamin Thomas. It's really well written in the 40s and 50s. And there's another guy, J.G. Randall, who's a great writer, who wrote a great essay about sort of all the people who hated Lincoln and why, and he was widely hated at the time. And he collected it in a series of essays in a book called Lincoln the Liberal Statesman. And this is not liberal as in left, it's classically liberal, open, and actually talks about the tragedy of Woodrow Wilson at Versailles. But it's a really interesting and surprising book. It's out of print now, but you can still find it, Lincoln the Liberal Statesman. What else? Joel. Thank you. Well, sure. I mean, beginning with the oath of office. He's taken an oath to preserve and protect the Constitution of the United States, and with that is a preservation of the Union. Alexander Stephens, the Confederate vice president, once famously talked about Lincoln's almost mystical attachment to the Union. And I do think there is something deeply spiritual about Lincoln's love of America. In his ride to Washington as a president-elect, he gives a speech in Trenton that I quote from, where he describes Americans as God's almost chosen people. And I love the almost there. It does a lot of work. But he really does believe that America is a unique nation in the history of the world. We are the only nation founded on an idea, an ideal, and not on a tribal identity. We represent the whole question of whether democracy can succeed. I mean, all the aristocrats and autocrats in Europe are waiting for us to fail. When the Civil War breaks out, they were like, we told you so. And they were setting their watches to when they could come back and reconquer and divvy it up. And so America has a meaning beyond itself, Lincoln believed. That's why our patriotism is different than mere nationalism. It's more open. It's more expansive. It's more inclusive. That's the whole ballgame. And so when Lincoln talks about democracy, it is fused with, he has the sense of a cosmic democracy. He says that our theory of government is universal freedom. And he doesn't see a lot of these things that are in tension, like liberty and equality, as contradictions. He sees that they will work out in the practical balance of the Union. And, counselor, I think also as a lawyer, he believes deeply in mediation and reasoning together. And that's what's, I think, so extraordinary about his example, is if he is able to remain true to his belief that there's more than unites us than divides us as Americans, even in the middle of a civil war, if he doesn't give in to the temptation to do the us against them, if he manages to keep empathy with his enemies, which is strained in our time, God knows, that's an example we should look to and aspire to, even though we will fall short. So I'm not surprised he didn't give up on it. Yes, sir.
We humans love to see patterns in everything.
Yeah.
The question that I have is, do you see a pattern between Lincoln's life and where we are today? And if so, what part of the chronology of Lincoln's life would you analogize to today? And the second half is, if Lincoln were here now, what would he say or do about our condition today?
Well, he'd be fascinated by electric lights. Look, Mark Twain is often quoted as saying, history doesn't repeat, but sometimes it rhymes. And so the whole book is an implicit rhyme, but that doesn't mean I can say, well, I think we're in February 1862. I don't. I also think that, one of the things that study of the Civil War right now can remind us is that we've been through far worse before. For all our deep divisions, and they're really serious, we are dealing with a challenge to democracy that in some respects is old. There have been resistance to multiracial democracy and majoritarian democracy throughout the history of our republic. And that's to form a more perfect union of it, right? It's something we strive towards and we never arrive at, right? We're not utopians here in America, in a good way. And that's where I think also Lincoln's moral humility kicks in, that understanding of human frailty that keeps things, at a scale that's recognizable is important. But the whole book, I think, reads, there are implicit riffs. Sag Harborite Mike Hogan, who's a dear friend of mine, who's the executive editor of Vanity Fair, did an excerpt, and I was surprised at the one he chose, but he did the one where I talked about the Confederates and the secessionists and how they couldn't win a popular vote for secession in their respective states. They had to do it in these sort of closed-door conventions. And then the violence of the war is what really polarized the vast majority of the South. And the reason he was attracted to that is, the implicit parallels are pretty clear. It's more that we have to learn from it. There's nothing resembling fatalism in recounting the story of the Civil War. It's more that we need to recognize the danger of when our politics turn tribal. When we start really being unable to reason together, when we lose that basic sense that democracy is about assuming goodwill among fellow citizens, when that seems too far. It's a cautionary tale, but because I love applied history so much, and that's the point of the book, right? And really, in all of Lincoln's speeches, he's drawing on the past to apply it to the present to guide us to a better future. But there's this really obscure speech he gives that I think takes it all down a peg and makes it more relatable. Actually, the night after he wins re-election in 1864. And this, by the way, it's all the marbles. 1864, a lot of his aides are saying, why would you have an election in the middle of a civil war? Like, if you lose, it's over. And it would have been over. And in August, Lincoln has one of his depressive fits and feels that, I'm going to lose. And he even writes a letter predicting his defeat and has his whole cabinet sign it closed. But he pulls it out. It's actually pretty decisive, in part because Sherman takes Atlanta in September, which really changes the whole tenor around the success of the war. But he gives a speech, and I use it as the epigraph, and I hadn't seen it widely before, but it's the whole ballgame to me that gets to part of your question. He says, human nature will not change. In any future great national trial, compared with men of this, we shall have as weak and as strong, as silly and as wise, as bad and as good. Let us therefore study the incidents of this as philosophy to learn wisdom from, and none of them as wrongs to be revenged. And what's so extraordinary about that isn't just that, we see the past in these sepia tones and everybody seems so distant, as silly and as wise. That he's talking about future trials, the application of the lessons of his own time. He's seeing his own time through the eyes of history and saying, let us see it as philosophy to learn wisdom from, not as wrongs to be revenged. And that's where I think we often go wrong when we talk about our history. We become captive to it. Lincoln's reconciling leadership's predicated on the idea, even in the middle of a war, that you can imagine a future that's not predetermined by the pain of the past or the present. And that makes all the difference. So that quote to me is what sums up the whole ballgame. We should be careful when people indulge these divisive tribal forces in our politics. We should be aware that democracy needs to be defended actively. That defending it is just as heroic as winning it in the first place. And we should recognize that we're playing with dangerous forces right now. But we have been through far worse, and we will get through this, especially if, as citizens, we take responsibility to do so. We go here and here. I don't know how much more time we have, but I'm having fun. Tommy John's definitely going to get a question.
So
Okay.
you took the kernels of Lincoln's plan, vision for peace, and those core values, and you took them to Europe after World War I, and talked about how they coalesced into a way forward. So this question isn't for Lincoln; it's for you. How do you take those? How do you take those kernels or those core values, and take them to Russia now, or to Ukraine, and what guiding principles can you tell us to look for, to hope for, or to pray for?
Well, that's obviously the most difficult question because we're dealing with a live fire conflict right now that doesn't really apply. I mean, to the extent that the Russians are trying to reconquer Soviet land, the Ukrainians weren't in rebellion or civil war, despite what Katrina Vanden Heuvel tried to argue against me on Bill Maher the other night, which drove me batty. And what I think does apply is that this is a direct challenge to the liberal international order that was established after the First World War. Ukraine's not part of NATO, and I do think that one of the many factors at work here is that they gave up nuclear weapons under a security guarantee, assurance, not guarantee, without being part of NATO. Putin changed his tune on Ukraine entirely. Part of the reason he's here is that the rest of the world didn't stand up sufficiently when he snuck into Ukraine and annexed it while lying about it the entire time, because of course. And so bullies only respect strength. I mean, you need to push back. And the fact that Biden has coalesced the world. I mean, former Secretary of State Condi Rice said the other day that it really shocked the host on Fox she was talking to. She gave Biden high marks and said, "I've never seen in NATO so united." What is being tried right now in terms of the global reach of economic sanctions, and really the word sanction doesn't really capture what's happening. It is so intense and targeted particularly at the elites, the oligarchs and Putin and the Kremlin kleptocrats and cronies, that it may ultimately undermine Putin's regime. In the meantime, he has clearly gone all in. He is, there's an open question of whether he's willing to risk the worst definitions of total war. He's threatening nuclear weapons. I don't think you should have your decisions determined by psychotic people's threats. I think he has become more unhinged. But whatever happens when it's over, I think is what applies. If, as I hope, ultimately this leads to an implosion of Putin from within, because the Russian people don't support this. There are courageous Russians protesting on night 7 in St. Petersburg at enormous risk to their lives. The generals were clearly not all on board on this, and that we may ultimately see this as a tipping point where Putin does the old imperial overreach game. At that point, I think we need to make sure, by we, I mean the United States, the Western world, really reaches out and helps Russia and Ukraine rebuild. A real investment in peace to try to depolarize that situation. In a perfect world, that addresses their security concerns without buying into this idea that the existence of NATO itself is a security concern. There was at one point talk about bringing Russia into NATO, which is a little bit mind-bending, but whatever can be done to rebuild and invest and heal those wounds, because you see, it's not a problem with the Russian people. You see that in the protests right now. And God bless Zelensky and the example he set around the world. And the example the Ukrainians are setting is just unbelievable. And my colleagues who are in Ukraine right now covering the war, at enormous risk, I'll say I'm so proud to be at CNN and to work alongside them, especially in a moment like this. All right. Thank you. All right. Young man, and then Jerry, and then we'll go here. You.
What was the hardest part writing the book?
Thank you. First of all, I feel so old having said young man. That is so lame. Really, geez. What's your name? Finney. What a great name. I love the name Finney. Okay. The hardest part of writing a book is actually writing the book. I mean, the research is kind of fun, but this is my 4th or 6th book, depending on how you count it. I did 2 anthologies with friends of mine, and then and every one I make the same mistake where you're researching and it's really fun, and you think you're writing the book while you're researching, and then you remember that you're actually not until you start putting words on pages. I love the editing. I love the crafting of it. But the hardest thing, and actually this is really important, particularly if you want to have anything resembling a creative career, is that even if you do this for a living and you get better over time, there is an inevitable gap, and I assume even Eric probably can relate to this. And April, there's a delta between what you imagine and certainly your first draft, but even your final draft, right? You imagine something that exists on a heart and soul level, and if you fixate too much on that gap, you'll never get anywhere, because it's humbling and a little heartbreaking. But over time, you close that gap. And that's why I think I love the process of editing, although I fall into a frequent writer trap, which I do not recommend, where you edit every time you sit down, you edit what you just wrote. That's not the most efficient way to write. But it's really about doing and steering towards that vision you have, realizing that it's really the writing itself is what you judge it against, not what you imagined in your mind's eye. That's an unfair comparison. Yes?
To what degree Lincoln applied that pursuit of a perfect union post-conflict interpersonally?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. There are so many, and there's those little stories that are throughout the book. One is the wounded Confederate
I'm
soldiers.
thinking family, like among families
Oh.
or among.
Sure. So I'll give two examples. One, during the war, this idea of the politics, the golden rule, it can sound trite. I would argue that if you actually think about, treating people as you'd like to be treated, a lot of really complex questions get a lot clearer, right? I mean, among them slavery. I mean, he's appealing to moral imagination, but he has all these examples where he says, I never knew a good thing that a man wouldn't want for himself, And at the end of the war, the Confederates get desperate and they try to offer slaves freedom in exchange for fighting for the Confederacy. And this boggles Lincoln's mind, and he gives a great speech kind of mocking it. But during the war, Mary's family are Confederates. And Mary's brother-in-law is a Confederate general who dies at Chickamauga. And they have Mary's sister, a Confederate war widow, stay with them at the White House for weeks as she grieves. And this sets everyone in Washington, they say, they're harboring secret Confederate sympathy, but it's a wonderful expression of that we're going to grow past this, and family, we're going to, and by the way, she refused to sign a note of allegiance to the Union before she entered the White House. But that's an example. There's another beautiful story about a general named Rufus Berenger. Towards the end of the war, Lincoln hears that they've got a captured Confederate general, and he has this boyish streak in him. It's a little like Churchill, where he said, I've never seen a Confederate general in uniform before. So they call him over, and he's he likes to hang out in telegraph offices. It's like a very constant thing. He loves technology, by the way. And Berenger comes in, and he stands up and greets him. He looks at him, he says, looks familiar. He says, Berenger, are you from North Carolina? He says, yes, sir. He said, you didn't serve in Congress, did you? He said, no, sir, I didn't. He said, I thought not, but you look familiar, and I actually served with a good friend of mine in Congress, was a guy named Berenger. And we were Whigs together, and we used to sit at the same table, and he says, he was my chum. Just such a weird word, but he says, he's my chum. And he says, well, that was my brother, sir. And Lincoln beams, and they sit down and they talk for an hour about the war and their families and the respective strengths and weaknesses of Confederate and Union generals. And at the end, he says, is there anything I can do for you? And Lincoln's aides crack up in the back, and they were like, well, yeah, you could. And Berenger's like, if anyone can help me, it's probably you. And he says, well, fair point. And so he writes a note to the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, and he says, look, this man is a Confederate general. You're going to go to a prison in Washington, and I hear it's not a very nice place, but let me write a note to this friend of mine. And he says, just this man is a brother of an old friend of mine, and don't treat him any differently, but just keep an eye out for him. Right. And he hands it to him, and Berenger chokes up, and as he goes outside, they hear him sobbing outside. Mm-hmm. And it's that transformative power of kindness, particularly from a position of strength. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Tommy, did you have anything? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm curious about what the tenor of Congress was like in the spring of 1865. Was Lincoln signaling to the South, what Reconstruction was going to be like, as well as the leaders of Congress?
Yeah, so great and complicated questions. So as a legislator, you'll appreciate that Lincoln is working very effectively with Republicans in Congress and passing a number of laws that he hopes will help pave the path for a nation after the war, even in the darkest days of the war in 1862 in particular. And it's made easier to pass the laws because there aren't any Southern Democrats in Congress anymore. So the number is working out pretty well to have an executive working with Republicans. But they pass a number of incredible laws that really do create a framework for reuniting the nation. The Transcontinental Railroad, the land grant, the Homestead Act, which basically sponsors people to build homes in the Western, and then land grant colleges. Lincoln's, one of his core ideas is that economic expansion westward is going to help us grow out of our north-south polarization. And so he sets up the structure to achieve it. He, in his last days alive, he's talking about how he wants everyone to move west and mine. He's very concerned about the national debt. He said, we have these great natural resources, and we're going to get wealthy and pay down our debt. And he's also, and he was welcoming immigrants in, by the way. He more than doubles the amount of immigrants in the country. But he does it legislatively. He's thinking structurally. Congress at the time, in his last speech, he's dealing with with Congress. He actually has kind of a federalist vision for each state's reconstruction. He thinks it's going to be a little bit different. It should be, because he wants to get buy-in, and each of the states are pretty different. He's fixated on Louisiana in particular, partly because we'd conquered New Orleans and reconquered it in 1862. Partly he'd been there as a young man, and he knew there was a Creole class. There was something like a multiracial community. But the radicals in Congress and some of the reactionaries wouldn't seat the Louisiana delegation, each for their own reason. So he's really frustrated about that. So they're squabbling and fighting. He is preparing to have deep political disagreements and some drag-out fights with the radicals in particular. He said they keep thinking that you can humiliate these people, and I think that's the wrong way to go. He wants to rebuild, and he doesn't want to re-empower. He doesn't want a restoration, which is what the conservatives are calling for. Not going to allow that. But to such an extent where there's Ohio Senator Benjamin Wade, who's a leading radical Republican, is furious with Lincoln, thinks he's going to be too lenient on the South. And actually, in like the days leading up to his death, he even says that he hopes Lincoln will be assassinated. And he hopes it because he thinks that Andrew Johnson will be tougher on the South. And tells Johnson that when he assumes the presidency. He said, thank God Lincoln has died. You'll be tougher on the South. But they misjudged that one big time. Basically, they thought he was a race warrior and he was a class warrior. But yeah, there's a lot. I'm always interested in the mechanics of governing. And, I'm interested in the policies that, it's you got to put the ideas into action. And so there's a lot in the book about what are the structures. I spoke to a lot of generals from, policy experts from the, Army College, the War College, about stabilizing gains and, how you stabilize military gains, and then how you can build, it's called conflict transformation now. But it really is, the way Lincoln was thinking about it, stabilize military gains, establish law and order so there's not a vacuum that will lead to vigilantes, political reform to remove a root cause of the war, economic expansion, and then cultural reintegration. That's actually now accepted formal doctrine, and it's known as conflict transformation. And Lincoln anticipated it. It's extraordinary. Yeah. April.
How did Lincoln
Great question. Not as badly as some would have you believe. I mean, first of all, his only time where he is serving in the military, he's elected an honorary captain in the Black Hawk War. They see no combat. He says, the only thing he killed were a bunch of mosquitoes. He's growing up on the frontier, and obviously there is what we would recognize by our time an enormous amount of prejudice. The Indian Wars have gone on. I mean, Andrew Jackson is the one who really is like world-class worst in this front. He gets a lot of criticism today. This was the alleged argument for why his name should be removed off school in San Francisco, was that he presided over a mass execution of, I think it's 38 Dakota Sioux, actually in Minnesota. And it's true. It's the largest mass execution in American history. But what doesn't get written about is that he pardoned something like 214 of those same people who had been condemned to death in this uprising rebellion up in the colony, up in the territories. And that Minnesota's Republican senator said, you shouldn't pardon any of them. Lincoln pardoned a lot of people, and he enjoyed it, and everyone else had drove them batty. So, I think it's always tricky to apply too much of our own contemporary lens on the past. There's a level at which it's normal, natural, and forgivable and human. But in that specific instance, which is what people often cite, they forget that he pardoned more than 200 of the members of the Sioux tribe that were arrested and condemned in the same uprising. And he actually went through each of their cases. It wasn't arbitrary. And so I think that's a good example of the context that I think is important to sort of addressing that particular concern, which is usually shorthand for Lincoln and the Native Americans. Fair? Yeah? Sure. Anything you want. We're in your church.
You're citing John Wilkes Booth, listening to him giving one of his final speeches.
Mm-hmm.
And when Lincoln mentions emancipation, it's annoying to Booth. And when
That's one word for it.
And when he mentions voting rights for blacks, he goes batshit crazy and states, now I'm going to like have to kill him. I mean, he absolutely vows to do him in. So, and I thought, oh my God, if that doesn't resonate with today, I don't know what does, because it's like that. It's all the gerrymandering that's going on. It's all the district redrawing. It's everything. It just, that never will. It seems like, will that never let go?
Yeah, I mean, it's fundamental. I mean, you can't understand American politics unless you understand the politics of race. And David Blight said, you know, we'll have a politics of the Civil War. We're going to have a politics of the Civil War as long as we have a politics of race in this country, which is to say probably forever. But to understand the fault lines that are created and the way that the violent reactions, you know, one of the things I chronicle is that one of the things you hear Confederates over and over say, even and especially at the end of the war, that they're obsessed with the idea that they will be enslaved by the blacks in the North, right? But there's no self-conscious awareness or irony around this, by the way. But the horrors of the post-Civil War Reconstruction, the violence. I mean, the reason the Anti-KKK Act gets passed is that the Klan is riding under the leadership, quote unquote, of Nathan Bedford Forrest, former Confederate general, who, by the way, if you want to just go into the statue debate, he's the one who had a statue built to him in 1970 in the Tennessee State Capitol. So we want to talk about what are we really talking about here? And it was an attempt to not only using violence to intimidate voters, but to kill black legislators. I mean, we had briefly a significant number of black legislators in this country in the 19th century. And then, you know, you start seeing Confederates serving on courts, ex-Confederates serving on courts, declaring things unconstitutional like the Civil Rights Act, invalidating the prosecution of a number of men for a massacre called the Colfax Massacre in Louisiana. And one example of many, just in Alabama, in 1900, Alabama has 180,000 black registered voters. 2 years later, they have 3,000. And this all happens, you know, this happens over 20, 25 years. And the violence that was used to do it, the scars of that, the arguments used to justify it. There's a group called the Redeemers that come to power in the South. They're bringing white supremacy and the Democratic Party back. The Democratic Party is dominated from the South by ex-Confederates. And they are actually running to cut spending and cut taxes, despite the fact the South desperately needs to rebuild, because one of the things they're doing is they're trying to defund public institutions that are integrated at that time. So, you know, these stories, particularly Reconstruction, is incredibly resonant. And I do address it in one section of the book, but we have not done we are nowhere near adequately understanding and appreciating, I think, what happened during Reconstruction. But I'll tell you one thing, it is a major, it's why you can never take our gains for granted in this country, or in any country. But that's the kind of object lesson. Eric, did you have one?
Yeah, I'm hoping it turns into a question. Because I'm, well, first of all, I've been sitting here for the whole time in such a, just a state of awe at the ease of your intelligence,
Thank you.
and more particularly your eloquence. And what I noticed in the way you've talked about Lincoln, you were somebody who appreciated the eloquence that he did, that he was able to put clarity in terms that were both poetic and simple and rational and reasonable, et cetera, which seems like a major goal for not only for leadership, but for insight, for compassion, for understanding. And I'm also sitting here thinking of how that kind of eloquence is not something that we see today the most general way among our leadership, that striving for a certain kind of clarity that simply because of the construction of its speech connects itself to the deepest traditions of our language, right? And brings all of that forward to the moment. And I'm just wondering, this is like a fake question, but at least it should end as a question anyway. Now I'm just wondering if you see among the people that we see every day in our leadership, et cetera, something that even approaches the aspiration of that.
That is a question. It's a great question. It's a tough question. Look, first of all, let me say that, we're not going to find another Lincoln. And that's an unfair standard. And Lincoln was rare in his time as well. It's really important to remember Lincoln, acknowledged our greatest president, is bookended by two of our worst, like by a lot, right? So it's not like there were a bunch of giants striding around the stage, and we were lucky. And again, on paper, he seemed like spectacularly ill-suited to that job at that time. But what we can find is, I think, individuals of a similar spirit. And I love that phrase because I do think there are individuals of a similar spirit, and you sort of find your spiritual tribe creatively, right? You find the lineage you fit in, and it's a soul thing. And in terms of Lincoln's leadership and that combination of empathy and honesty and humor and humility and eloquence, but one that was, communicated in stories and eye to eye, never talking down, never talking up, which I think is the best part of democracy. That's the similar spirit. I think that one of the reasons Obama rocketed to the presidency is I think he had an ability to communicate with that force of history behind him. Just hearing, Obama and to some extent Bill Clinton at his best could really weave and synthesize the past, the present, and the future. And I think that accounted a lot for their rise. And by the way, not for nothing, but if you look at our top 10 greatest presidents of all time, around half have no formal education. So it's not about that at all. I mean, Lincoln has no formal education. He's a self-taught lawyer. Washington has, literally none. Harry Truman never went past college and, one of the greats. So it's not about that. It's about people of a similar spirit and character and the ability to grow. I do think there are better and worse communicators right now. I think Joe Biden is not a great communicator or a great orator, although I think he can give a good speech. It's actually more about his character that I think is what elevates him, which is reinforced if you talk to people who have known him and worked with him over decades. I've never met someone who knows him well that doesn't say he's a good man. And that's a stable foundation as any. But it's not, what you're talking about. In terms of if you're asking me to pivot towards the next election cycle, I don't have a savior for you. But I will say that I think putting more of an emphasis on character and decency, that's the thing we should be looking at above all else and maybe to the exclusion of all else.
John,
Yeah.
have you ever thought of running for office?
April? Sure. Thought about it, if I'm being honest, of course. And I won't lie. Mostly this way. I worked in government as a young man, and I went into journalism, and my feeling is that they're two sides of the same coin, or they should be, right? You care about your community, you care about your country, you care about moving forward a civic debate. Ideally, you like policy, and the fact that my background was originally in government, unlike, I think, many journalists, I'm actually interested in, solving problems, right? Even as a columnist, my rule was I try not to criticize unless you have a solution, and I don't mind getting wonky and talk policy. I also think that it's something that in a self-governed society you shouldn't do. It should be a chapter of your life, right? you know, public service and politics should be a chapter in your life. It shouldn't be the only thing you do. And I think, among other reasons, I think because it probably leads you to make bad decisions. And I feel incredibly blessed to be doing what I'm doing now.
Well, we feel incredibly blessed to have had you here tonight.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for this. Thank you for all this. That was great. Thank you. Oh, thank you.